This year marks the 80th anniversary of the July 7 incident in July 1937. What changes did this incident bring about, and how did it influence China's contribution to fighting fascism in World War II? Some Japanese politicians are still in denial of its country's war crimes and try to throw doubt on the legitimacy of the judgment from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, particularly regarding the Nanking massacre. What is the attitude of Japan's current government, and what would happen if Japan were to fully acknowledge its crimes and aggression of the Second World War? This year also marks the 45th anniversary of the normalization of China-Japan diplomatic ties. But 5 years ago, bilateral relations suffered sharply due to the Japanese government's nationalization of the disputed Diaoyu Islands. How can China and Japan develop friendlier and more stable relations?
80 years ago, the July 7th incident in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army provoked full-scale aggression against China and left huge casualties and losses, as well as a brutal memory to the Chinese. 45 years ago, leaders from China and Japan made the bold move to normalize their diplomatic relations, which is more recently being dampened by issues such as territorial disputes between the two and the Japanese government attitude towards the war crimes, including Japanese leaders' visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. So how does the regional situation continue to be shaped by the brutal and unacknowledged history in the Second World War, and 80 years on, where are Japan-China relations headed in the context of a complicated and sensitive West Pacific? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Mr. Gui Yongtao, Associate Professor of School of International Studies, Peking University. We will also talk to Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University, by satellite. And that's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let's talk about the incident 80 years ago, July 7th, 1937. It marked the start of Japan's full-scale aggression against China. And then the war, the Second World War, which a big part of course, is the China theater. How did the war change China, Asia, and the world in general? Mr. Rong?
Oh, indeed. I think the incident, or this Marco Polo incident, July the 7th, did change, I think, both China and Japan a lot in a tremendous way. Before that, we all know with that Manchuria incident, I mean 1931, it was more or less a kind of a local conflict, I mean, or conflict on a limited region, that is China's northeast, between China and Japan. But after that incident, I think it signified, as you rightly said, that it is a full-scale war between China.
But do you think it was Japan's plan all the time to occupy much of Asia, have what they call the Asian co-prosperity region?
There are, I think historians I think there are differences about that, about the views about whether it was a planned or it was an incident or accident or whatever. But I think the fact is that after that incident, China and Japan, I mean, there was a full-scale wars between China and a local conflict, which largely relied by the international community, or thought that it could be solved with I mean, negotiations or even to come to terms with peace. Now I think, at least from the Chinese side, at that time the national government realized that it's not possible. So it followed was another, I mean, in just less than, I think 1 month later, there was a, we called August the 13th, I mean, war in Shanghai, and then afterward the Nanjing massacre. So that was, I think, the beginning of a full conflict between the two countries. And then it is, of course, I think marks the beginning of China's sort of certainly sacrifice, but also, I mean, contribution, I mean to the anti-fascism in the war. So China was the first, and also the largest, I think, one of the largest in the Second World War, and then leading to the victory and the triumph of 1945.
But a lot of the problems between China and Japan now can find its roots in the Second World War, in the understanding of the Second World War. How did it happen? What kind of war was it? Why there was such a difference of understanding of the war between China and Japan?
After the Second World War, there has not been a consensus within Japan on how to view their war responsibilities. The liberals would like to recognize their war responsibility and would like to apologize, while the conservatives has always been reluctant to admit the wrongdoings of the Japanese Imperial Army. And in recent years...
And the conservative on the winning side of the argument.
Yes, in recent years, the conservative politicians are getting ground and currently is enjoying a majority in the Japanese government and the legislature. So their voices becomes louder in recent years, which makes the problem even more complicated.
But it's just inconceivable if the rest of the world turned their back on the atrocities in the Auschwitz concentration camp in Germany or Dachau. But the Japanese, some of the Japanese, can even deny there was a fact of Nanjing massacre, which killed over 300,000 Chinese. How can Japan manage to do that, and how can the rest of the world bear with it?
I think this is a very good point. I would like to go back a little bit about the so-called differences between the war or between the course of war. I think from Chinese perspective, for the international community as a whole, there's no dispute at all. The war was an aggression. It was an aggression by one nation, to another, which is totally, I think, it's clear. The only difference, if there's any difference, is that those, right wings, those revisionists, of the Japanese would like to deny the, try to find an excuse to defend why Japan would launch the war and how justified, to some extent at least, that is they want to find for that war. Look at some of the remarks of the state.
That's not the rest of the world understand Japan's role in the Second World War.
That's why I think the Nanjing massacre is important in the sense that we need to, let the international community, particularly the the Western audience, to understand this is a massacre which has been, unfortunately, not been known to the outside world. I think until 1950s, right? And still, I think there are evidence, strong evidence, and documents,
diaries,
but
videos, photos,
particularly by the West. That the Japanese kept on denying that, by saying by trying to challenge the details, or challenge even by that, they hoped, wishfully, that they would deny the fact as a whole. So we need to really make sure that they say this is the history, this is the fact, this is the reality, whatever or whenever. It is a fact. Nothing can deny.
Let's get some Japanese perspective on that. Let's turn to Mr. Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. So, do the Japanese perception of that period of history evolved since 1945?
It is, you see, very complicated. However, one thing is very clear. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan learned many things from the West, technologically especially, and then Japan wanted to be the king in the Asian area, and first Japan fought against Russia, and Russia-Japan war was not defeated or not you see, got the victory. However, Japan did not, you see, get the defeat. So then Japan got some confidence to go to the Asian continent through Korea and then China. And all the things that our colleagues said in the studio, I agree with them. However, the more bigger is a trend or stream should be found in this case. It is true that Japan invaded Korea and China, and also Nanjing massacre took place by the Japanese military force.
From many Chinese perspective, it's just not an invasion, it is a genocide. 300,000 Chinese were murdered in this capital. It is compared to Nazi Germany did to Poland and Czechoslovakia. But the Japanese never think like this. Why?
I myself visited that museum, and it is true. But Japan, you see, military regime and the people's idea, or people between the two, were so different. And also, poor farmers, the soldiers who come from the poor families in the farming areas, fought against Chinese because they were given wrong information that they can get the richer life and the farming areas and everything. So these things, you see, were complex.
Okay.
However, yeah, the massacre took place. It is true.
And do you think the Western world, especially the media and historians, have anything to be blamed for not paying so much attention to what happened in the Asian theater in the Second World War? They don't treat as what happened in China as what happened in Europe.
Well, to some extent, I think the Western media and the Western world as a whole had some bias in the sense that what happened in their part of the world is certainly for them is more important
Is more
than that.
abominable,
Yeah,
than what the Japanese
And
did.
even I think on the question of the China's sacrifice and the contribution, as we said at the very beginning, to the victory, to the fight against this fascism, it was, I think, not until quite a few years before to fully recognize that is, what happened in China, or the China theater, is a very important sort of part of that war against fascism.
Except for some serious historians, it seems that China's role in the Second World War has always been underestimated, especially among the public in the West. Mr. Gui?
Well, of course, even when the historical studies in the West would be always, to some extent, linked to the current politics. And because the Second World War, the European part of the Second World War, of course, had more relevance to the current political discussion and problems in Europe, that's understandable. But on the other hand, if you ask average Europeans, they usually do not have much knowledge about what was happening in other parts of the world, especially in the Western Pacific. Actually, because many European countries were at that time colonialist powers, they fought directly with the Japanese army together with the Chinese. But these information were not necessarily given to the average public.
Let's talk a little bit about modern politics with Mr. Watanabe. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, his reversal of the pacifist constitution that were shaped after the Second World War, especially Article 9. That was controversial. It has met protest from both within and outside Japan. Why does Mr. Abe insist on trying to revise the pacifist constitution? What has it to gain from that revision politically?
Mr. Abe was born in 1954, and he doesn't know what really happened in Asia and also in the lower class people of Japan. And his grandfather was the prime minister. You see, Japan renewed a new security pact with the United States. And Mr. Kishi, his grandfather, was given a lot of money from the American government to organize the first stage of the LDP. It is very clear from the document found in the United States. So these things were organized very badly, and Mr. Abe learned that aspect on those things. And he has the dream to be the new leader of Japanese people, but it is, you see, coming to the end because of the overwhelming defeat in the
You mentioned the importance of U.S.-Japan alliance, but do you think the United States, at the bottom of the heart, does the U.S. want to see Japan become what it called a normal country by reneging on its pacifist constitution and sending forces overseas as it wishes?
when you see United States sees Japan as a friend, the peaceful, you see, Article 9 is good. But when he wants to see Japan as a military friend to fight against China and North Korea, he wants to have Mr. Abe's you see, policy. Yeah.
And
he has two faces.
And do you think it will happen? Japan will pass that new constitution that will replace the pacifist one that was formed in 1940s?
So far, we have been discussing very seriously, and some people are very afraid of being revised by Mr. Abe, but recently new opinions are coming because of the defeat of his party in the election, because he needs 2/3 majority of the Congress, but it is now very difficult because coalition party Komeito is leaving or will leave very soon.
So politically it will be
So
difficult
it is not
for
so
him to
easy.
get there.
Yes, yes, that's right.
All right, thank you very much for your insights there. You're now watching World Insight, watching Dialogue rather, on CGTN. We'll be talking about the July the 7th incident that took place some years ago. We'll be talking about the current politics and economic relations between China and Japan later on in our broadcast. Don't go away. So, Mr. Rong, what is your assessment of current China-Japan relations? It has been strained several years ago because of Japanese government purchase of Diaoyu Islands, and it's been ups and downs, but it seems it has improved over the past few years, and probably President Xi will meet Abe sometime down the road. Is it improvement of relations?
There are, improvements. Certainly, I think if you look at the relationship more than 5 years ago, when we were supposed at that time to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the normalization of the relationship, and unfortunately, the celebrations or events were not able to. It didn't happen simply because, as you said, the so-called nationalization of the Diaoyu Island, and also there are other incidents or the problems between the two sides. And 5 years later, definitely, I think the relationship is now more or less on better shape and on the right track. But still, I think problems remains, and we hope that the Japanese government, the Abe administration in particular, they will take, as we always said, the right positions, right attitude toward to find a way, that is, as we say, to meet Chinese side on the halfway, so that the relationship will be. And for that, the most important thing is that we always say they will have the spirits of the 4 political documents, and particularly, I think.
But do you think Abe will evolve ideologically? Some say Abe's ideology is just incalcitrant. He will not budge on his stands on the Constitution issue, on the Diaoyu Island issue. There is no trust between Abe's government and Chinese.
Well, to some extent that's true, because we believe that Abe, Prime Minister Abe, will not change his personal ideology. But on the other hand, we also have seen that diplomatically he has been behaving relatively cautiously in recent years, because his ideology has been criticized not only by Asian neighbors but also by many other countries, including its key ally, the United States. So we have to balance these two aspects of the administration. And currently, as is mentioned by our guest speaker in Japan, and because the ruling party in Japan has lost a major local election, and this has posed quite big challenge to the administration.
He was weakened politically.
He was weakened politically, and we can predict that he would put even more emphasis on economy rather than ideology or politics.
Economically, it seems also Japan is in a rivalry with China. Japan is trying to have a free trade deal with Europe. Japan is reaching out to Southeast Asia. China is doing the same. So this kind of economic rivalry, is it wholesome? Is it constructive?
There's two aspects. If you look at the bilateral trade and economic relationship between China and Japan, and I think that even conservatives in Japan believe, they admit the fact that China was the biggest, the single most important market for the Japanese economy for the foreseeable future. But on the other hand, many people in Japan also believe, especially the political elites believe, that China is growing economically more powerful than Japan. So if
but
Japan...
Is it a threat or an opportunity for Japan? More threat or more challenge?
To put it simply, multilaterally or in the broader region, Japan sees China as a challenge to their existing status. But bilaterally, they have to, let's say, take care of this important economic relationship with China.
Mr. Watanabe, what do you make of the economic rivalry and also partnership between China and Japan, the second and third largest economy in the world? What kind of synergy will that be?
Japan and China can work together, can go hand in hand, because recently Japanese government had to decide or support your One Belt economic route in Asia, headed by the Chinese government, because if not, the middle class or the larger, rather larger, business class circles cannot live well without the cooperation with Chinese economic circles. So Japan had to change our economic policies. And also, I was for 3 weeks in the United States last month. The people in America came not to believe in the words of Mr. Trump. It was very clear. So Japan, China, and the United States, the people's level, they are thinking of the cooperation.
And do you think
the trend should be changed?
Do you think any geopolitical incident might change that? Because recently the ICBM launched by DPRK dropped into Japan's EEZ. And Japan decided to purchase more Aegis combat system from the US. It has always been wanting to do that. How does Japan fit into the Korean Peninsula crisis? What is the ambition of Japan militarily?
On those things, you see, the Japanese government is criticizing North Korea. However, ordinary people are not so keenly influenced by those words of the government, because the people believe that the North Koreans, or even the North Korean government itself, they are not crazy. They know what to talk, what to do, and so if we have the channel to talk with them directly, better solution should be coming up.
Here in China, many people regarding Japan's recent move as kind of a military expansionist, although there is argument there. Japan has built Izumo, its largest helicopter destroyer, and is trying to join ASEAN countries to patrol the South China Sea, which China doesn't want to see happen. How does China view Japan in a military confrontation? Is that possible?
I don't see in the foreseeable future, if the two sides, Chinese and the Japanese, manage their differences well in a constructive way, there's a possibility or probability for military confrontation. But I did agree with the Japanese guest, Watanabe-san, that the Japanese government, particularly the Abe administration, is trying its best to capitalize the current sort of tensions on the peninsula to push its own agenda, and which I think is, the security, so-called reform and self-defense, and the revision of the constitution. And for that, it would raise the tension and also create more problems between the countries, in the region, certainly with China.
But what is actually Abe's agenda militarily? Does Japan really want to be have a modern military that is capable of having a war or even confrontation with China? Is that feasible?
Well, for many decades after the Second War, has been relying on the United States
for
the
security.
security. But in recent years, Japan has become less confident about the guarantee offered by the United States.
It wants to be self-reliant.
They have to be somewhat increased, they believe, their self-reliant capability. That explains the increase of military budget for 4 consecutive years.
This is not something the Japanese public wants to see happen.
Yes, there's a major gap between the Japanese government and the Japanese public on this particular issue. So last year and 3 years ago, there were major demonstrations by the public against the government policy on security issues.
So a lot of this will be dependent on how the Japanese politics evolve down.
Yes, it depends on to what extent the administration would enjoy a high, let's say, supporting rate, and if the current government would continue to be weakened, then it will be difficult for the Japanese government to continue its ambitious policy on security affairs.
It has been some years since the last left-leaning government in Japan took power. Do you think it is possible that the left wing will probably come to power anytime soon if Abe is weakened politically or economically?
For the moment, we do not see this kind of probability because the opposition parties are even let's say, much weaker than the ruling party. So there is no unified, strong opposition, and we do not see an effective political agenda offered by the opposition parties either. So what we could see in the future is a somewhat weakened ruling party, and which might result in a modest political agenda in Japan.
And finally, diplomatically, Japan has been adding a lot of pressure on China, reaching out to Southeast Asian countries and also trying to cozying up to Taiwan by changing an agreement. They call it Japan International Association, want to change the name to Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association, which China has protested. So China should react to Japan's diplomatic pressure on China.
I think definitely the Chinese side made it very clear that these, moves, negative moves, touching upon China's core interests, like the question of Taiwan and others, would be dealt with forcefully, resolutely. And because the Chinese government made it very clear, I think this is something, But in the long run, I think we only hope that, as we said, the domestic politics in Japan is, undergoing changes. We'll see that in the end, they would take a positive attitude.
We're running out of time. Thank you very much for your analysis on this. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.